Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.
There are lots of different terms for war, and you've heard me talk about on the show how my favourite term for war is war. You've heard me begrudgingly admit, though, that different terms for war and different types of war, particularly the different characters of war, are important because words have power and they help shape thinking and understanding. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast, the only podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. I think there could be other ones out there. I actually don't check. That's a bit of a false claim. But I do know we are the one that has all the ratings on iTunes and regularly features in the top 100 charts. So I do appreciate the loyal listenership we have out there across the globe. We did get some amazing stats recently in Norway, which is brilliant. I do know they have a very engaged military professional education program there. So maybe that's why, or maybe just some family was visiting and they took me with them. I'm not really sure. But it is great to have all the feedback on iTunes, emails. It's great for our premium subscribers who are emailing me, which is absolutely fantastic. Thank you for doing that. And also thank you for supporting the show via premium subscribers. And those listeners that have been with us for nearly a decade will know that we have switched to an advertising supported model. That is so that we can keep bringing you shows well and truly into the future. Now, if you want to keep supporting the show and you don't want to listen to ads, check out the premium subscription on Apple Premium. If you are on another service, we are looking at other ways to provide you the easiest options for premium subscription. So it won't be exclusive to Apple forever, but at the moment, that's the only way you can pay for us. Now, listeners, you heard the intro. Yes, we're talking about another type of war, and yes, you know I'm a bit begrudging when it comes to different types of war in terms of titles, but you also know that in the past I've conceded that they're actually very, very important in how we think about war in the modern world. Now, we're going to be talking about irregular war today, and it's a pretty important one because, one, it's pretty much covered in Clausewitz's under partisan war, but also it's one that I think a lot of the audience may be familiar with, having spent nearly 20 years, a lot of us, working through a war that is very, very irregular, or a couple of wars, actually. I suppose there are a couple of wars, all just sort of bundled together as a package deal. But I'm not an expert. As you know, I don't really know much. All I know how to do is talk and ask questions. So I've got an expert in today who's just written a book on irregular war. How's that? Coincidence, hey? So my guest today is Jonathan W. Hackett. He's the author of Theory of Irregular War. He's a seasoned US Marine with 2 decades of diverse experiences and has served in agencies such as the Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and the Marine Special Forces Operations Command. That's Marine Forces Special Operations Command. My Australianisms came out there. So beyond his military and intelligence roles, he has also taught human intelligence operations and security operation in Virginia. Jonathan, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Hey, Mick. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks also for the scheduling. So we're so far apart in time.
Not a problem. Now, Jonathan, you are a member of the Department of Defense, so I'm going to assume that everything you say here is your personal opinion.
Definitely, yeah. I have to say, the canned statement that everything expressed is not necessarily the view of the DoD or the U.S. government. It's my views purely.
Well, that's a great thing because I actually got you on the show for your views, which is brilliant. And we don't. I could get the department's views, but they do media releases, so I could just look at that. Now, Jonathan, before we get into the guts of irregular war and regular warfare, one thing I'm really keen on understanding is, and I think from your bio, I've probably got a little bit of an understanding. I think our listeners can probably pick up on it. Lived experience tends to have a pretty important motivational factor. But what inspired you to focus your research on irregular warfare?
Well, I spent a lot of time in these types of conflicts that we're going to talk about. And both as an intelligence professional and in special operations, over the last 20 years. And over the years, I started noticing a lot of patterns. Patterns not only in the way the wars are fought, but why do they start and who chooses to fight in these wars. And I noticed that a lot of the doctrine that we use and also scholarship, it's very biased toward the Westphalian state. And what I mean by that is the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, when the 30 Years' War in Europe ended and all that. But it's worldwide now. It's not just Europe. So all states have this same concert where they work together, from China to Canada, Australia to Algeria. And it's really dominated the literature for the past 4 centuries. And I remember the first time when I read Dead Carl's On War, I was on a mission in the Middle East, actually, and I read the whole book out there. And he briefly talks about Volkskrieg, People's War. It's just a couple of pages relative to the rest of the book. And that was very telling to me. And Clausewitz himself thought that this type of war is not the type of war he was writing about. He was writing about something else, kind of, with components of it in there, but really something else. And I thought to myself that if Clausewitz himself is saying that this is not part of his general thesis, why are we using Clausewitz so much as a foundation for studying and executing these types of wars? I can't tell you how many times I heard Clausewitz mentioned before my deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq and all this stuff. And it doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't quite add up. And I think we've expended a lot of blood and treasure on those wars, and we don't really understand those wars. For example, the figure I hear a lot is $300 million a day, every day for 20 years was spent in Afghanistan. That should really invite some scrutiny about, was that well spent? Both from scholars and practitioners. And having been in wars like this, seeing the effects of acting without really understanding, that's kind of what inspired me, because I want to know why. So that's what led me down this pathway.
It's fascinating when we have practitioners on the show, all right, because I obviously come from a similar background to you, although not human intelligence. I can't convince people to do anything, but but an artillery background myself. In fact, I was a problem for the human intelligence people because of the nature of the war and the coordination issues. And it's not good when you take out someone's asset by accident. But the that's a euphemism. Take out listeners. If you watch a lot of action movies, you know what I mean. But it is interesting when you talk about the blood and treasure that was spent on these wars and what inspires people to move into scholarship, I suppose, from the profession, and a lot of people doing it while they're maintaining the profession, which is also fascinating, right? And it's good that you had a shout out to Bikal there, because we do know that so much thinking has been based on how he talks about warfare and war, and he did briefly talk about Volkskrieg, but not much. And even though he trained partisans, like he trained, his actual professional life, he actually did a bit of training to get people ready to rebel. But for him, that was a sideshow to what was the main battles that we've kind of had our heads stuck into. So one thing that Carl talks about is the nature of war, right? And in your book, you talk about the nature of irregular warfare. Could you explain how then this is just a tiny question. Can you explain how the social, territorial, and political dimensions uniquely shape irregular warfare?
Well, I guess that will take a simple answer then too. The big thing I hear a lot is that the nature of war is unchanging. The character of war is what changes. I mean, you look at our warfighting publications, and it's almost on every page. I'm exaggerating, but really it's everywhere. And no one really ever asks, what does that mean? They kind of just take it as the truth and just move forward. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. A well-known example is for social order, for example, because there's a couple different categories of stuff going on here, but I'll pick the social order category first. The monarchy in France, as we all know, in the 18th century, it was the sovereign over the French people, over the French land, over the social order and all these things. And it had been in various forms since, Christmas of the year 800, when Charlemagne stepped forth and all that, in various forms. But really, it began growing decadent, lost efficiency. The bureaucracy expanded a lot. and the gap between average society and the state started to calcify in such a way that it was impossible to cross the gap between poor to rich. And I think that had a huge effect on the social order, because now there is a frustration with the sovereign state on the social order, because people expect the state to act a certain way. And when the state stops acting that way, we have a problem. But Jean Locke actually talked about how it takes a lot of grievance to push someone to violence. It's not just a little bit of grievance. In fact, it can be almost backbreaking grievance that lets a social order absorb that abuse. So, we know in the French Revolution, they decided that they want to remake the social order, destroy that dysfunctional sovereign that was keeping the social order alive, that bad social order in their view. And then when we describe this culminating event as the French Revolution, really the actual process was much longer, over a broader time horizon. It did not end with the terror, with all the executions. There were more stages that came over all of the 19th century. You had multiple Paris communes. You had the baton of power violently passing between people and monarch, back and forth, back and forth. So really, that the French Revolution was not a moment. It was an idea. And I think it's really important to point out that even in this really big, well-studied example, there's no clear-cut remaking of the social order, and it's more of a punctuated equilibrium, kind of like how in evolution we have these long periods of nothing and then short periods of large change, and it's a violent change between the people and the state, and that violence grows when the sovereign becomes less functional. So as like the sliding scale of functionality decreases, you get more of this grievance converting to violence. And the violence subsides when the sovereign increases functionality. When things either get better or change, violence will also change, because violence does not occur in a vacuum. But that social, territorial, and political dimension you ask about, it's similar, the other two, the territorial and the political, similar processes going on there, because at the bottom of it, it's that sovereign dysfunction that is affecting those three things, those three categories of things that shape how irregular wars come out. And that's a new idea in the book, actually, sovereign dysfunction. And when I was going through peer review, I actually had some pushback from the peers reviewing, because they had never heard of sovereign dysfunction. I said, that's the whole point. I mean, it's a new idea.
It's an excellent term. I know that we're going to ask more details on sovereign dysfunction for our premium subscribers. So it's great that you're putting forward new ideas, because it'd be a shame for this show to get someone on with the same boring old ideas.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, let's talk about theoretical differences, noting that was a huge question, really, I put up for the very first one. And normally I work from general to specific in terms of questioning, and we do have some specific questions for you at the end. But I'm more interested right now, because you've mentioned it and a lot of our listeners have seen it, and we're seeing some really, I'm going to say interesting listeners, but please don't take that as a euphemism for all the horror we're seeing right now in Europe and in the Middle East, in terms of the two, one conventional conflict and one, I don't know, semi-conventional. I've just made something up there. I'm not going to put it in a book. I'm not going to let anyone peer review it because it's off the top of my head. But, we're seeing some interesting developments in warfare and war, right? And we know that there's elements of set piece battles. There's what could be called partisan type conflict as well. But largely, most of our audience, and I suppose most of the people who haven't experienced war, get their information from pop culture, the news, and very, very, very limited ways of thinking about war, very much Clausewitzian conventional warfare. Now, in regards to your book and also your experience, what way does irregular war theory sort of diverge from conventional war theory?
Well, first, it's about the who and the why. And in your episode about the principles of war, you raised some questions about this, the divergence between theory. And there is a divergence, I think, between irregular war theory and conventional war theory. They're not commensurate. When we think about conventional war, we're talking about being used as an instrument of policy. That's like frequently thrown around. It's a policy device but we're talking about war being used as an instrument of policy between states, state on state, who are all living in this sort of anarchic world that we see in international relations theory, books like, Kenneth Waltz's Man, the State, and War and Theory of International Politics and all these things. That's how war is in those books, and that is not all of it. We see this, it's like a state-owned enterprise of war as a policy tool between states, and the state's at the center of this, about how people theorize on conventional war. I mean, the word conventional kind of implies that it's this predictable, repeatable thing. Think about like the great wars, World War I and World War II. Those are certainly conventional wars, and the theories apply there. But we have a divergence when we're talking about who is fighting and why are they fighting. I would say that irregular war is a sovereign weapon, for sure, but it's wielded violently not by a state. States can be part of it, they can be an ingredient, but they're not a sufficient ingredient. In other words, the state being there is not enough to make it irregular. While the opposite's true in conventional wars, the states being there violently, that is enough for it to be a conventional war. So that's an important distinction to tease out, because the state's at the center of that conventional theory, while the people, an organized group specifically making violence, that is looking to fix that sovereign that's dysfunctional. And they also have no other way to fix it except to smash it. And you see that in some literature, smashing the state and this idea. The really important thing there's no other way, because people, like I said earlier, they'll let their backs be broken before they pick up a weapon. There has to be some huge culminating force that pushes them outside to fight against their state. So you can see how the irregular war theory focuses less on violence, and it's less on ethics, less on who is right or wrong. It's more of why. More on actual human dimensions, where the grievances are forged into action. Because conventional war theories, they often think about victory or defeat. There are other things, but those are two major components of that. While irregular war theory is about solutions, those are value neutral things, solutions. Whereas victory and defeat they're heavy with value, depending on which side is looking at it.
It's interesting when I get a guest on who blows my mind with some stuff, right? So the way you expressed it, and I can't believe it's only just come to my head, and, I've done quite a bit of study in this area, but, the idea that conventional is predictable and repeatable just sticks in my head because, this past year we're recording in 2023, listeners, but releasing in 2024. But I've hosted some panels and discussions at various events, and, the one thing a lot of speakers, particularly former generals and things like that, talk about is how we've got a 100% track record in predicting the next war, right? And we've always got it wrong, but we still seem to have this theory of war that's predominant that, as you said, kind of points to just a subconscious understanding that it's by convention and off you go, which I guess is really, really dangerous in some ways. But war's not necessarily supposed to be non-dangerous. Now, Jonathan, I don't want to give away everything in the book, right? Because we need people to buy your book. Well, I don't need people to buy your book, actually. I do care because you're a guest on the show. But if you weren't a guest on the show, I wouldn't care. But I do want to talk about like the key lesson from your book that you believe is most crucial, and this one's important for. And this is a subset of our audience, so if you're not one of these people, that's fine. There's no judgment. But I do know the majority of my listeners wear a uniform or wear a policy-making shirt. So I'm keen to understand what key lessons from your book do you think are the most crucial for practitioners in irregular warfare?
Yeah, so about a third of the book, I actually discuss something that I think is very important, especially for people coming from a conventional war perspective. And something about method, about the approach. I spend a lot of time tracing the history of how our viewpoints, when I say ours, I mean, the military establishment, traditional military activity establishment, has developed over the centuries. And I show how these viewpoints are a little bit misguided at best in the context I'm talking about. I call this, I give it a name, I call it the synecdoche trap. So it's a crucial element to understand the difference between war and warfare, which you have also talked about before, that they're not the same thing. And the synecdoche trap, it revolves around a couple of problems that we all kind of bring to the table when we look at war. This problems of scope, method, bias, character. And I get into a lot of detail in the book about it, but those are 4 separate problems that we bring to the table when we look at war from a state perspective. And I want readers to take that away from the book. Do not fall into the synecdoche trap, which takes conscious effort to not do. Don't fall victim to the replacement of critical analysis with comfortable heuristics. And Clausewitz warned about this, actually, in his book. There's one heuristic he called methodismus, or methodicism, which it's a pseudoscientific way of approaching wars. It's a marriage to tactics and kind of an ignorance to strategy, or even higher level policy. And that's very dangerous, because it's kind of a fantasy. It's idealism and preconceived notions that people are bringing baggage with them to the planning table, and using that baggage to make the plans rather than using the data to make the plans. And a lot of people are awed by tactics. And I want practitioners and theorists to walk away thinking about that, being careful of that.
It's a great insight, because it ties straight into something I've been reading recently about Roman generals, because we're producing another show called On Rome, releasing in 2024 as well. Or it might already be released by the time our listeners listen to this. So if it is, listen to it, people. But a lot of Roman military leaders were statesmen, and they had no real way of being developed as generals. They did the lower sort of positions on their climb up the ladder, but there was a strong belief that if they just studied the tactics of the other wars, that's how you became a competent general. Which ties people into, it's habits, it's heuristics, it's everything, right? And so it's dangerous right now for I suppose a lot of the Western militaries who've got 20 years of experience in irregular wars, in the long wars or the forever wars, and falling back on those traps. Like, I know as an artilleryman, you definitely couldn't go into different types of wars doing it the exact same way we did it, because we're pretty damn comfortable the way we
yeah.
fought, lattes and bombs, and that's not the most appropriate for each time. So it's benefit from your experience, I suppose, is the key takeaway I'm gonna take from that. Now, Jonathan, we do owe our premium subscribers something. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a premium question now. And for those people who are premium subscribers, you'll get another question right now, and the topic's going to be on sovereign dysfunction. And for those people that aren't premium subscribers, we still love you, but you don't give us any money. So what we're going to do is we're going to play an ad for you, so that someone else will give us money, so you don't have to. But you also, unfortunately, miss out on some of the premium content. And so we'll just pause. And we're back with everyone. And Jonathan, thank you very much for that answer on the question regarding sovereign dysfunction. It was quite enlightening. And as I said, the theory feels familiar. It feels like something you've just been waiting for people to put a name on. So we now have a name on it. And we also have a book out there, listeners, that you can grab. Now we come to the final part of the show. And this is sometimes been referred to as the butcher's bill. It's the price I make every guest pay for coming on the show. It's probably a bit cheeky of me calling it a price, given that I don't have subpoena powers or anything, and guests kind of come on here willingly anyway, and now I'm charging them by asking them a final question. But I'm going to do it anyway. And it relates to our mission. You've talked about some of Big Carl's work, and our mission here is to continue the conversation. We're not a Carl worshipping show. We've had some pretty anti-Clausewitzian views on the show. I've never loved his book every time I've read it, just because it's painful to read. And that's after his wife tried to fix it for him, right? So what we do, though, is we do try and focus on examining war in all its forms and its relationship with a society, and keep the conversation that Big Carl was trying to have going. So, Jonathan, now I'm going to ask you to finish a sentence. The sentence is war is. So, Jonathan, please finish the sentence. War is.
So I thought a little bit about this after hearing some of your other episodes and thinking about how would I say this, and have some brain cells in my answer. But I came down to something like war is, it's not a street fight, but a street fight might be war. And what do I mean by that? Well, like I talked about, war is sovereign violence. It's not a fight between people on the street, unless those people are fighting over who has ultimate authority over the street, the authority over the social cohesion of the fighters in it, or over the best way the fighters should order themselves. So you can have people without war, but you cannot have war without people.
That is an answer with a whole heap of brain cells attached to it. So you've definitely achieved your goal. I like it. War is not a street fight, but a street fight might be war. And I tell you what, in my youth, I've got some scars actually now from some street fights that felt like they were war. But they were actually just, I wasn't looking for a higher order in terms of political order. I was just too full of rum, to be honest. But Jonathan, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking about your theory of irregular war and your book, The Theory of Irregular War.
Thank you so much, Mick. I really appreciate the time to talk with you about it.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, please go out and buy Jonathan's book. We've just given you just over half an hour of good theory goodness. Some of you got it for free, so you've got a little bit of extra tin in your pocket you can now go spend on a new book, which is a great way. You can find it pretty much everywhere. The Bezos Corporation, Amazon, if you buy it through the show links in our notes, you'll send some money from Amazon to us, but you can pretty much get it everywhere else. I do know Barnes & Noble have it in the US, and in Australia, probably more your specialist bookstores, but you can definitely order it in. I've done all the rounds in checking for it, so grab that. It's published by McFarland, and it's called Theory of Irregular War by Jonathan Hackett. Now, ladies and gents, thank you very much for the support and return to 2024. We're not sure how many episodes we're going to have this season. We're thinking between 10 and 15, which gives you roughly one a month, although we probably won't be releasing them as a monthly basis, but we will try and have a season that is established and released regularly. We do know there's been a lot of disruptions over the past couple of years. We've enjoyed your loyal listenership, so we appreciate that. And we do also appreciate those premium subscribers that have hung on for a while on Apple Premium. And also our premium subscribers in all the past incarnations of our premium offerings. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Follow the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod and Facebook at facebook.com/thedeadprussian. The Dead Prussian podcast is hosted and produced by Mick Cook. The Dead Prussian podcast is copyright of Mick Cook.